Whispers called him the Devil of Ravenscroft, a man so scarred and ruthless that sunlight itself seemed to flee his presence. But when Adelaide was traded to this cursed duke to pay for her sister's vanity, she didn't find a monster in the dark. She found a broken king. The autumn of 1872 brought a bitter chill to the Somerset estate in Cornwall, but the temperature in Lord Edmund's study was suffocating. Adelaide Somerset stood near the heavy oak doors, her hands neatly folded over the worn cotton of her day dress, listening to the destruction of her family. "It is £50,000, father!" Victoria shrieked, pacing the Persian rug. Her silk gown rustled with every frantic step, a stark contrast to the decaying grandeur of the room. 50,000. How could you gamble away my dowry? My future Lord Edmund, a man whose spine had yielded to years of bad investments and expensive gin, kept his face buried in his hands. The Duke holds the promissory notes, Victoria, all of them. If he calls in the debt, we lose the house, the lands, everything. You will not marry Viscount Whitmore. You will be a beggar on the streets of London. Then negotiate. Victoria snapped her perfect porcelain features, twisted in a rare display of genuine panic. Offer him the northern tenant farms. Offer him the silver. He does not want silver. Lord Edmund whispered, finally looking up. His bloodshot eyes bypassed his golden-haired eldest daughter and settled heavily on the quiet girl by the door. He wants a Somerset bride. The silence that followed was absolute. Duke Alastair Montgomery of Ravenscroft was a name spoken only in hushed, terrified tones in polite society. 4 years ago, a catastrophic fire at his Yorkshire estate had nearly claimed his life. He survived, but the man who emerged from the ashes was rumoured to be something less than human. Half of his face was said to be melted wax, his temper feral, his mind fractured by agony. Society dubbed him the Cursed Duke. He had not been seen in London since. A bride. Victoria breathed the panic, morphing into a cold, hard sneer. He thinks he can buy me. I am to be a viscountess. I will not be locked away in a Yorkshire dungeon to play nursemaid to a scarred beast. If one of you does not marry him, the debt is called— Lord Edmund said, his voice cracking. We will be ruined. Victoria stopped pacing. She looked at her father, then slowly, deliberately turned her gaze to Adelaide. A slow, cruel smile touched her lips. He asked for a Somerset bride, father. He did not specify which one. Adelaide felt the air leave her lungs. For 20 years she had been the shadow to Victoria's son. While Victoria was paraded through ballrooms in Parisian silks, Adelaide was left to manage the household accounts, mend the linens, and placate the angry creditors at the back door. She had no dowry, no suitors, and no illusions about her place in the world. Victoria, you cannot mean— Lord Edmund stammered, though the weak gleam of hope in his eyes betrayed him. Why not? Victoria reasoned, her voice suddenly sweet, dripping with venomous logic. Adelaide has no prospects. She is already a spinster by society's standards. She is plain, she is quiet, and she is accustomed to dealing with difficult situations. It is the perfect solution. She pays your debt, she gains a title, and I marry Percy, as planned. Adelaide looked at her father. She waited for him to defend her, to say that sending his youngest daughter to the bed of a madman was an unthinkable cruelty. Instead, Lord Edmund looked away. Adelaide! He muttered, his voice trembling. It would save us. It would save your sister. Adelaide's jaw tightened. She looked at the peeling wallpaper of the study, the empty spaces where ancestral portraits had already been sold off, and finally at her sister's triumphant face. Victoria wasn't just sacrificing her, she was enjoying it. I will do it, Adelaide said. Her voice was remarkably steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. But on one condition. Both her father and sister stared at her in shock. Adelaide never made demands. "Name it," Lord Edmund said quickly. "You will transfer the deed of the dower house in Bath to my name alone." Adelaide said, her grey eyes locking onto her father's. "If the Duke kills me, as the rumours suggest he might, it reverts to you. But if I survive, and if he ever throws me out, I will have a home that neither of you can gamble away or sell." Victoria scoffed. "You are in no position to negotiate." "Done," Lord Edmund interrupted, waving a frantic hand. "The papers will be drawn up tomorrow." 3 days later, Adelaide was placed in an uncrested carriage. There was no wedding ceremony, no white lace, no well-wishes from friends. Lord Edmund had signed a proxy marriage contract. She was simply packed into a coach with 2 trunks of Victoria's cast-off woolen dresses and sent north. As the carriage pulled away from the only home she had ever known, Adelaide did not look back. She did not cry. She simply pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders as the carriage rolled toward Yorkshire, toward the moors, and toward the beast of Ravenscroft. The journey took 4 agonizing days, the landscape shifting from the gentle green hills of the south to the jagged, unforgiving heath of the Yorkshire moors. By the time the carriage breached the heavy iron gates of Ravenscroft Keep, a brutal rainstorm was lashing against the windows. Through the blurred glass, Adelaide saw her new home. It was a fortress of black stone, perched on the edge of a jagged ravine. Gargoyles snarled from the battlements, and the windows were dark save for a few flickering candles on the ground floor. It looked less like an estate and more like a mausoleum. When the carriage halted, the door was wrenched open by a tall, gaunt man with a lantern. He did not offer his hand to help her down. "Your Grace," the man said, his voice devoid of warmth. "I am Mr. Abernathy, the butler. Welcome to Ravenscroft. The master is not receiving visitors." "I am not a visitor, Mr. Abernathy," Adelaide said smoothly, stepping out into the freezing rain unaided. "I am his wife, and I am quite tired." Abernathy blinked momentarily, thrown by her composure. He had likely expected a weeping, terrified girl. Adelaide Somerset was terrified, but she had spent a lifetime learning how to hide it. She was led inside to a cavernous entrance hall. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, damp stone, and something else faint but unmistakable, the metallic tang of medicinal alcohol. The house was dead quiet. There were no footmen, no maids rushing about, just shadows and silence. "Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, has prepared your chambers in the east wing," Abernathy said, shaking out his umbrella. "You are to take your meals in your room. You are not to wander the house after dark. And you are strictly forbidden from entering the west wing. Do you understand?" "I understand the instructions," Adelaide replied, peeling off her wet gloves. "But I do not understand the reason. Why am I forbidden from half of my own home?" "Because that is where the Duke resides," a sharp voice echoed from the staircase. A stout woman in a severe black bombazine dress descended the steps, holding a ring of iron keys. "Mrs. Gable. And the Duke does not wish to be looked upon, Your Grace, least of all by a woman who was sold to him." The barb was intended to wound, but Adelaide merely lifted her chin. "Then it is a blessing I did not come here to look at him, Mrs. Gable. Please show me to my room." For the first 3 days, Adelaide was treated like a ghost. She was brought decent, but bland meals. Her fires were lit by a silent, terrified-looking scullery maid named Molly, and she was left entirely alone. She did not see her husband. She did not even hear him. But on the 4th night, the silence broke. It was past midnight. Adelaide was sitting by her hearth, reading a crumbling volume of poetry she had found on a forgotten shelf, when a sound echoed through the stone corridors. It was a crash, the violent shattering of glass, followed by a low, guttural roar of absolute agony. Adelaide froze. The sound came from the West Wing. "You are strictly forbidden from entering the West Wing," Abernathy's voice echoed in her head. She looked at her locked door. Then she looked at the dying embers in her fireplace. If she stayed in this room, hiding like a frightened mouse, she would be a prisoner forever. Victoria would have won. Her father would have won. Adelaide stood up, grabbed her iron candlestick, and walked out into the dark hallway. The air grew colder as she crossed the central gallery and approached the heavy oak doors of the West Wing. The doors were slightly ajar. Slipping through, she found herself in a corridor lined with shrouded furniture. The roaring had stopped, replaced by heavy, ragged breathing emanating from a room at the far end of the hall. Adelaide pushed the door open. It was a massive library, but it looked as though a hurricane had torn through it. Books were scattered across the Persian carpets, a mahogany table was overturned, and a crystal decanter lay shattered against the stone hearth, the smell of strong brandy thick in the air. In the center of the destruction, a man knelt on the floor, his back to her. He was massive, his shoulders broad and corded with tension beneath a loose, sweat-soaked linen shirt. His dark hair was long and unkempt, brushing the collar of his neck. He was clutching the edges of a heavy armchair, his knuckles white, his head bowed as he took deep, shuddering breaths. "Abernathy!" The man rasped his voice, like grinding stones. "I told you to leave the laudanum at the door and get out." Adelaide did not move. "I am not Abernathy." The man went dangerously still. Slowly he released the chair. The tension in the room spiked the air, crackling with sudden violent energy. He rose to his full height, towering over her, and turned around. The right side of his face was a masterpiece of aristocratic perfection. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and an eye the color of storm clouds. But the left side was a ruin. The fire had taken no pity on him. The skin was scarred, pulled tight and twisted from his temple down to his collarbone. His left eye was milky and blind, framed by jagged, angry flesh. He waited for her to scream. He waited for her to drop the candle and run, just as the servants did, just as his former fiancée had done 4 years ago, before breaking their engagement. Adelaide did not scream. She lowered the candle slightly, so the glare would not hurt his good eye. "You are bleeding," she said quietly. Alistair blinked, genuinely thrown. He looked down at his right hand. A shard of crystal from the decanter had sliced open his palm, and thick, dark blood was dripping onto the carpet. He hadn't even felt it. The phantom pain from his burn scars usually eclipsed everything else. "You are trespassing," Alistair snarled, taking a step toward her. He leaned into the light, intentionally exposing the worst of his scars, trying to terrify her. "Did they not warn you about the beast in the West Wing, little bride? Did they not tell you I am Maud? They told me you were cursed." Adelaide corrected her voice, frustratingly calm. "But a curse implies magic, Your Grace. That looks like a severe burn that wasn't properly grafted, and a cut that is going to become infected if you don't let me bind it." Alistair stared at her. She was tiny compared to him, dressed in a faded woolen wrapper, her brown hair falling in a simple braid over her shoulder. She was not beautiful like the women of his past. She was plain, but the look in her grey eyes was something he had not seen in 4 years. She was not looking at him with pity. She was looking at him with annoyance. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I am Adelaide," she said, stepping fully into the room, expertly avoiding the broken glass. Your wife. And if you are quite finished throwing your glassware at the walls, I suggest you sit down before you bleed to death on this magnificent rug." Alistair Montgomery, the Duke of Ravenscroft, was unaccustomed to being given orders. For 4 years he had been a phantom in his own home, ruling over his terrified staff through furious, booming decrees issued from behind locked doors. His scars had become his armor, his volatile temper, the moat that kept a pitying, revulsed world at bay. Yet here stood a diminutive woman in a faded, threadbare wrapper, calmly instructing him to sit down as if he were a disobedient schoolboy. He stared down at Adelaide, waiting for her composure to crack. He intentionally kept his ruined face angled toward the flickering candlelight, letting the grotesque twisted flesh of his left cheek and jaw remain fully visible. Most people, even his own physicians, averted their eyes when forced to look upon him. Adelaide did not. Her clear, intelligent grey eyes remained fixed on his, entirely devoid of the horror he so desperately anticipated. "Are you deaf as well as cursed, Your Grace?" Adelaide asked, her tone conversational, but laced with a distinctly impatient edge. She pointed toward the heavy leather armchair he had been gripping moments before. "Sit. The carpet is a magnificent 16th century Tabriz, and I will not spend my first week here attempting to scrub your blood out of the silk fibers." A stunned, gravelly sound escaped Alistair's throat. It took him a moment to realize it was a laugh, dry and unused. Slowly, cautiously, he backed away from her and sank into the armchair. He extended his bleeding right hand, resting it on the armrest. Adelaide moved with quiet efficiency. She did not ring for Abernathy or Mrs. Gable. Instead, she retrieved a clean linen handkerchief from the pocket of her wrapper and crossed the room to a small medical cabinet she had spotted near the fireplace. Inside, alongside the bottles of laudanum, she found what she was looking for, a dark glass bottle emitting a sharp medicinal scent. "Carbolic acid," Adelaide noted, holding the bottle up to the light. "I read about Dr. Joseph Lister's antiseptic methods in the Lancet last year. My father thought it unseemly for a woman to read medical journals, but then he also thought gambling away £50,000 was a sound financial strategy. Hold still." She poured a small amount of the harsh liquid onto the cloth and pressed it firmly against his palm. Alistair hissed, his muscles tensing violently as the acid burned the open laceration. "Painful, I know," she murmured, her voice softening just a fraction, losing its previous sharpness, "but far less painful than gangrene." As she worked carefully, picking microscopic shards of crystal from his skin before binding the hand with a strip of clean bandage, Alistair watched her. He noted the dark circles under her eyes, the simple, unadorned plait of her brown hair, and the steady, practiced grace of her hands. She did not tremble when her fingers brushed against his skin. "Why are you not afraid of me?" he asked, his voice low, sounding like velvet dragged over gravel. Adelaide tied off the bandage and finally looked up at his face. "Should I be? Have you ever struck a woman, Your Grace?" "No," Alistair said quickly, almost offended by the notion. "Then I have no reason to fear you," she replied, simply gathering the bloody linens. "You roar, you break things, and you hide in the dark. It is dramatic, I will concede, but it is hardly terrifying. You are a man in pain, not a monster under the bed. Now, if you will excuse me, I am going back to sleep. Good night, husband." She turned and walked out of the library, leaving the Duke of Ravenscroft sitting in stunned silence, his heart hammering against his ribs for the first time in years. By the end of her first month at Ravenscroft, Adelaide had quietly but firmly revolutionized the household. She did not ask for permission. She simply assumed command. She audited the estate ledgers, discovering years of gross mismanagement and petty theft. She summoned the estate manager, a thoroughly intimidated man named Mr. Harrison, and restructured the tenant farm leases, applying principles she had learned while secretly managing the Somerset accounts. When Abernathy attempted to undermine her authority by serving her cold mutton, Adelaide calmly threatened to write to Lord Rothschild in London to freeze the household operating accounts until a new butler could be hired. Abernathy surrendered immediately. The silent, terrified scullery maid Molly was promoted to Adelaide's personal maid, and slowly the heavy, oppressive gloom of Ravenscroft began to lift. Fires were lit in the draughty corridors. Windows were thrown open to let in the crisp Yorkshire air. And through it all, Alistair watched her. He no longer hid exclusively in his chambers. At first, he merely stood in the shadows of the gallery, observing her as she directed the servants, or sat in the conservatory, meticulously balancing his ledgers. But gradually, he began to step into the light. It started with small things. A book left on her desk that he thought she might enjoy. A fire stoked in the drawing room before she entered. Then they began taking supper together. They did not speak of love or romance. They spoke of crop yields, of philosophy, of the crumbling roof on the west wing. One evening in late November, a fierce snowstorm trapped them in the library. The fire was roaring, casting a warm, golden glow over the mahogany shelves. Adelaide was sitting on the sofa mending a tear in one of his hunting coats, while Alistair sat across from her reading. "You never ask about the fire," Alistair said, suddenly closing his book. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room. Adelaide did not look up from her needlework. "If you wish to tell me, you would. It is not my place to pry into your tragedies." "My fiancée," Alistair began the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. "She was trapped in the drawing room. A lantern fell. I went in to get her out. I managed to push her through the window, but a burning beam collapsed on me before I could follow." Adelaide finally stopped stitching. She looked at him, her grey eyes entirely focused on his face. "She survived," Alistair continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "Without a single scratch. 2 weeks later, while I was lying in a hospital bed, drifting in and out of consciousness, agonizing over my ruined face, her father sent a messenger. The engagement was broken. She could not bear to look at what I had become. She married a viscount 6 months later. He waited for Adelaide to offer empty platitudes to tell him that his former fiancée was a fool. Instead, Adelaide set the coat aside, stood up, and walked over to him. She stopped just inches from his chair, reached out, and gently laid her hand against his left cheek, directly over the worst of his scars. Alistair froze, his breath catching in his throat. No one had touched the left side of his face in 4 years. Her fingers were cool, gentle, and utterly fearless. "She did not love you," Adelaide said softly, her thumb brushing against the twisted skin. "She loved the Duke of Ravenscroft. She loved the title, the wealth, and the handsome face. I am sorry she hurt you, Alistair. But she was weak. And you are the strongest man I have ever known." Alistair closed his eyes, leaning into her palm, a profound, shattering relief washing over his soul. For the first time since the fire, he did not feel like a beast. He felt like a man. Spring arrived in Yorkshire, painting the unforgiving moors in vibrant, startling shades of heather and brilliant emerald green. The stunning transformation of the rugged landscape perfectly mirrored the miraculous transformation within the walls of Ravenscroft. The heavy, oppressive black curtains had been taken down by the hard-working staff, replaced by sheer linen fabrics that allowed the warm, glorious sunlight to flood the ancient cold stone halls. Adelaide had impressively brought vibrant life back to the dead estate, but more importantly, She had lovingly brought Alistair back to the joyful world of the living. He no longer walked with his broad shoulders hunched and his head bowed in shame. He no longer hid from the frightened staff in the dark corners of the West Wing. While he still greatly preferred the quiet, peaceful isolation of the northern moors to the bustling, judgmental streets of London, he rode out daily with his dedicated estate manager, Mr. Harrison, to thoroughly inspect the sprawling tenant farms. His scarred, ruined face was proudly bared to the crisp wind and the bright sun. He and Adelaide delightfully shared a grand bedroom, now their initial tense marriage of convenience having quietly evolved into a beautiful, unshakable partnership of profound, deep passion. But the cruel outside world had not entirely forgotten them. In early May, a lavishly crested carriage suddenly pulled into the circular gravel drive of Ravenscroft Keep. Adelaide was working in the sunny rose garden, her hands covered in dark soil, as she expertly pruned a stubborn, thorny bush when Abernathy came rushing out of the main heavy doors. The usually stoic, unbothered butler looked genuinely panicked. "Your Grace," the breathless butler stammered, bowing quickly and awkwardly. "You have unexpected visitors. Lord Edmund Somerset and Miss Victoria Somerset." Adelaide instantly stiffened. She calmly dropped her sharp pruning shears into her woven wicker basket and slowly wiped her dirty hands on her linen apron. She had not heard a single word from her terrible family in 6 long months. She knew precisely why they were secretly here. Lord Edmund's foolish gambling debts must have painfully mounted again, and Victoria, undoubtedly bored with her own useless life, had come to viciously gloat over her younger sister's presumed misery. "Show them to the main drawing-room, Abernathy," Adelaide said smoothly, completely hiding her chaotic inner turmoil, "and ensure you serve them the cheap tea." When Adelaide finally entered the brightly lit drawing-room, exactly 10 minutes later, Victoria was loudly and obnoxiously critiquing the vintage upholstery. She was dressed in an ostentatious, ridiculously expensive Paris gown of bright magenta silk, dripping with heavy, ostentatious pearls. Lord Edmund stood nervously by the tall window, looking significantly older and far more anxious than Adelaide remembered from her youth. "Adelaide, darling," Victoria sneered, spinning around gracefully. Her cruel eyes immediately dropped to Adelaide's simple, unadorned muslin day dress and the slight noticeable smudge of dirt on her pale cheek. "Good heavens, you look exactly like a common scullery maid. Has the beast finally forced you into mindless servitude? Then I suppose it is marginally better than having to share his cursed bed." "Victoria," Lord Edmund hissed nervously, glancing fearfully toward the heavy oak door. Adelaide calmly folded her small hands together, her beautiful face an impenetrable stoic mask. "To what do I owe this sudden displeasure, father?" Lord Edmund cleared his scratchy throat, frantically pulling at his stiff white collar. "Now, Adelaide, there is absolutely no need for such open hostility. We are family, after all. The honest truth is my various investments have taken a slight, unexpected downturn. The ruthless creditors are circling our estate again. Since you are the magnificent Duchess of Ravenscroft, and seeing as your monstrous husband is immensely wealthy, I logically assumed you could quickly arrange a small, discreet loan. Say, perhaps, £20,000. You literally sold me for £50,000 to completely pay your last massive gambling debt," Adelaide stated, her steady voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, freezing pitch. "And now you dare come to my peaceful home and boldly ask for more. Do not act so impossibly high and mighty," Victoria snapped viciously, stepping aggressively forward. "You are still plain, incredibly boring, little Adelaide. We all know you are utterly miserable here, permanently locked away with that disfigured, terrifying monster. Just give father the money from your generous household allowance." I highly doubt your mad husband even bothers to check the estate accounts. He checks them quite thoroughly, Miss Somerset. The deep, rumbling, authoritative voice suddenly struck the quiet room like a violent crack of summer thunder. Victoria gasped loudly, taking a desperate, stumbling step backward in sheer terror. Lord Edmund turned completely pale as a frightening ghost. Alistair proudly stood in the open doorway. He was dressed impeccably in a dark, perfectly tailored morning coat and a crisp white cravat, looking every inch the powerful, wealthy, aristocratic duke he was genuinely born to be. He confidently stepped into the brightly lit room, making absolutely no effort to hide his extensive facial scars. His stormy grey eye was firmly fixed on Victoria, with a look of such terrifying, cold, unyielding fury that the arrogant younger woman immediately began to visibly tremble. He walked purposefully past them, crossing the large room to stand directly beside Adelaide. Without breaking his intense, deadly gaze from the nervously sweating Lord Edmund, he quickly reached out and gently took Adelaide's hand, securely lacing his strong fingers intimately through hers. I hold the official promissory notes on the Somerset estate, Lord Edmund Orsach. Alistair stated, his deep voice dangerously soft and calm. All of them. I personally bought the remaining outstanding debts from your greedy London creditors exactly 3 weeks ago. You currently owe me well in excess of £100,000. Lord Edmund's weak knees suddenly gave out completely. He collapsed heavily into a velvet brocade chair, gasping desperately for fresh air. Your Grace, please, I am a completely ruined man. Did you enjoy this tale of defiance, redemption, and unexpected love? The shadows of Ravenscroft hold many more secrets, and we bring the most thrilling historical romances to life every single week. If Adelaide and Alistair's journey captivated your heart, please tap that like button, share this video with your fellow romance lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more breathtaking stories. Do not forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a chapter of passion and drama.